Okay, wonderful. So we can get started. Just 1 second. All right, we have the recording going. Excellent. Okay. Well, so welcome everybody to today's webinar where we're going to be exploring the topic from cradle to grave. Dr. Gabriella will be actually walking us through the various pinnacle rites of passage in Slovak life. So we'll be covering from birth to death, the lives of our ancestors, and how they were marked by specific customs and rituals, which we'll cover in today's presentations. As we know, and as we've inherited from our grandparents, great-grandparents, great-grandparents, we know that in Slovakia, there were certain traditions that govern childbirth, as well as the various key passages in life. And lastly, of course, the departure from this world to the next. So today's webinar is hosted in conjunction with the Jednota, the First Catholic Slovak Union. We've had this partnership going back, I believe, several years now. So as a non-for-profit organization that's based here in Slovakia, it's a great privilege for us to work with Jednota and of course to share our message and to share our knowledge with Jednota's community. So we welcome all the Jednota members that are joining us today. And now I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Gabriella to lead us through today's fascinating webinar.
Thank you, Zizi, and welcome everyone from me too. It's wonderful to connect with you again. It's been a few months, and without further ado, let's jump right in because we have a lot of ground to cover. And as per usual, there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the presentation part of the webinar. So we'll start at the beginning, at the birth, but before babies were born, sort of still at the at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, that was not the beginning of the process, because even today, we think about schools or whatever preparing for the babies to come, but in the past this was very different, and thinking about the baby actually started even before the baby was conceived and even before the wedding. So some of you might be familiar with Easter customs. Easter is coming up, and we'll be practicing certain traditions that were designed to actually safeguard fertility of women, and that was the water dowsing and the willow whipping, and that was kind of the beginning of it. So women, unmarried girls of marriageable age were all part of it, in order really to make sure that they would be able to bring children into the world, as that was the core of the existence of the family and also of the community. Once a couple got together, there are also certain traditions done at the wedding to not just make sure that the couple would be fertile and that there would be babies in the family, but also to influence the sex and the characteristics of the babies and the nature of the baby. It was certain also the tools that are typical for either the work of women in the family or the work of a man would be placed under the bed, depending on whether the partners wanted a girl or boy, and that was said to kind of influence or the process and to bring in the sex of the baby that the parents wanted. Once the baby was conceived, the pregnancy was governed by all kinds of rules, and those were not necessarily to do with the health or the welfare of the mother and the baby, but they were more governed by superstitions. Because we have to realize, many of you will know this, we are now talking about the time when child mortality was high, women died in childbirth a lot. So a whole set of beliefs and customs developed in Slovakia, in the folk culture, to try to prevent that from happening. So for instance, a pregnant woman when she witnessed a phenomena that featured either red or dark pink color, she was not to touch her belly under any circumstances, because that was said to put a baby in jeopardy. So when she witnessed sunrise or sunset, she was to be very careful about where she placed her hands. Similar when she saw fire. A pregnant woman was not to touch blood for the same reason. But on the other hand, there were not that many privileges that pregnant women enjoyed during the pregnancy. So they weren't really relieved of much of their duties at home. As pregnancy progressed, they would not be asked to do the heavy labor, but in general, it was believed that hard work in pregnancy would lead into an easy labor. So women worked pretty much to the point when the birthing process started. And once that was underway, the woman would lie down in bed that was separated from the rest of the room with a special cloth. And this was either over the bed, as you can see in the picture, or if bed was in the corner, it would be secured around it to create sort of a barrier from the rest of the room and from the rest of the house. This was to give the woman not just privacy, but again, it was said that this cloth that was special, it was not just any old thing that you would find. This would be part of the dowry, it would be passed down for generations, and it was said to have strong protective properties. So it would protect the birthing process itself, but also then afterwards, it was said that it would protect the mother and the baby during the first few critical weeks of after the childbirth. So this would be a white cloth that would be decorated with ornaments symbolizing fertility, or ornaments inspired by nature. And if that family could not afford that, they would at least adorn the cloth with red thread, because red was the color of protection, so to strengthen the effect. So when the birthing started and the women went behind that, only married women who assisted in childbirth would be allowed in there, nobody else. The husband was to stay way away from the process. And midwives really only appeared on the scene towards the end of the 18th century, and not everybody could afford to have a midwife present at birth. In fact, most people would call for her only in difficult cases. In most circumstances, the women that would assist with birthing would be either the mother-to-be's mother, or mother-in-law, or godmother, or some folk healer, or other wise, experienced woman from the community. And these were the women that had already gone through childbirth, so they had the experience, they knew what they were doing, and they were to ease the process. What happened during childbirth was again a mixture of kind of down-to-earth wisdom of our ancestors and superstitions. For instance, everything, all the knots on the pregnant woman's clothes were to be untied. Her hair was unbraided. All locks in the house would be unlocked to make sure that nothing was in the way of the smooth delivery, so the baby, wouldn't get stuck. It would come in smoothly and easily. But the knowledge of women was limited, and so, as I already said, it was not uncommon for women and babies to die during childbirth or in the weeks after that as a result of infections that resulted from the lack of proper medical knowledge and proper care, but also partly as a result of these certain traditions and beliefs. Once the baby was born and everything was fine, the woman who led the birthing process. So whether that was the midwife or the mother-in-law, she would take the baby, cut the umbilical cord, and place the baby either on the stove or under the stove to bless the baby with luck and good health in his or her life. Then the baby would be washed in water that usually contained a bit of honey to give sweetness to the life of this newborn baby, a coin to invite in prosperity to this new life, an egg, so the baby would be nice and round and healthy, a slice of bread, so he or she would be good-hearted and generous, and a dash of salt, so that the baby would have everything that he or she needed in life. All this was done in silence. And after the birth, the lead woman, the midwife, would make a sign of cross on the baby. Batter would be wrapped into the baby's body again to fortify the strength and health of this little new human. And if the baby was born in winter or in cold regions, people would also rub goose fat into the baby to protect it from cold. And only once all of this was done, the baby would be put in swaddling or just a piece of cloth, and then the attention would be turned to the mother, and care would be taken of her. It's interesting and little known fact that the placenta was either buried in a tree in the garden if the woman wanted to get married, wanted to get pregnant and give birth again. If she did not want to do that in foreseeable future, it would be placed in the attic, and that was safe to kind of take care of the wishes and the needs of the woman and the family. The mother would be bathed, she would be dressed in clean clothes, the bedding would be changed, and only at that point she would receive the baby, and that's also when the father would be invited in. It was an important ceremonial act for the father to take the baby and kiss the baby on its forehead as an act of acceptance of the baby into the family, as accepting the baby as his own. Once all this was done, the father would normally proceed with visiting the godparents to announce the good news and to also discuss christening and everything that was to follow. And godparents were very carefully selected because once the baby was born, they would become a part of the family and they would play an active role in the life of the baby. If the parents of the baby were to die, it was the godparents who were expected to take care of the baby, and it was not rare for that to happen in the age of pandemic diseases, poverty, etc. So that's why a lot of thinking went into who would be invited to become a godparent. And as soon as the baby was born, they would step in first with bringing gifts to the family. This would be a little money, cloth to make diapers, nappies for the baby, food. So this was their way of supporting the new parents and the baby in those fragile days and weeks. But their kind of visible role, the most visible role, would happen during the christening when they would be present. Godparents up until the First World War would normally not be relatives. The godmother would be most likely the best friend of the mother. The godfather would also be chosen from the close circle of the father. So not family members up until relatively recently. With baby born and everything being fine, started a period of puerperium, or in Slovak, 6 nedelie. So this is the period of 6 Sundays after the birth of the baby. In the ideal case, the mother and was expected to stay away from all work in the house, to stay in her corner, in her nook that was separated from the rest of the room by the ritual cloth that we mentioned earlier. These had practical reason. It allowed the woman to rest, to bond with the baby, and it was really a precious opportunity for a woman to rest for such a long period of time. Why this was done was also stemming from the belief that woman after birth was bleeding, so she was impure, and so she was to be kept isolated from the family. She was not to touch food, was not to leave the house, not to leave her corner, let alone the house, and she was not to interact with anyone except for the baby and that one chosen woman, either her mother, godmother, or mother-in-law, that would deliver her food and that would take care of her during those 6 weeks. Here in the picture, you can actually see women bringing food to the family where a new baby was born to support the family when the woman was out of, out of the normal way of running the house. For many families, however, it was not possible to relieve the woman of her duties for over a month. Families simply could not afford to lose the mother of the house, and they couldn't support themselves for such a long period of time. So if that was not possible, it was preferable that this period of rest would last at least 1 to 2 weeks. But in the poorest families, the woman would be back on her feet and working within 3 days of childbirth. Christening was absolutely critical in Slovakia, because this was not just welcoming the baby to the community, it was also a matter of cleansing the baby from the sins. And and therefore christening took usually place on the first Sunday after the baby was born, so fairly quickly. If the baby was sickly, then the christening would happen as soon as possible to make sure that the baby was taken care of. Because the christening happened so soon, and within that period of those 6 Sundays, when the mother was expected to keep to herself, she wasn't involved in the preparations for the christening. She was not present at the christening itself. This was prepared and orchestrated by the father and the godparents. The central figure of christening was the godmother, who was bringing the baby to the church for the christening. The baby would wear a thin white embroidered shirt. It would be wrapped in an ornamental swaddling, and usually that would also be covered with a blanket, with also containing protective designs, as you can see in the picture. And this is how the baby would arrive in church. The ceremony would take place, and after that, the godparents and the father and the baby would come back to the house, and the baby would be given back to the mother, but not through the door, but it would be passed to her through the window. Again, this practice is connected to the high mortality rate of the babies. And people believe that when the baby did not enter the house through the door, but through the window, that would confuse death herself, and the baby would be kept safe. There would normally also be a little feast, as lavish as the family could afford. If a woman had already completed, the mother had already completed those 6 weeks of isolation, she would participate in it, but this was not normally the case, because before she could enter the family and before she could enter life and leave the house again, she would have to undergo a ritual called the Vatska, which happened after those 6 Sundays, or however long the woman could afford to be out. And this meant that the mother would leave her little corner. She would put on her Sunday best, and together with the woman who assisted her in childbirth, she would go to a church. There, she would be sprinkled with holy water. She'd be given candle, a burning candle, as you can see in the picture, and she would walk around the altar. And this was the ceremony of purifying her after the childbirth and preparing her for that new life of the mother. And at this point, she was considered pure, cleansed, ready to enter society again and resume normal life. Vatska, today it might seem, oh, sorry, doesn't want to move on me. In today, Vatska might be considered as, like an ornamental piece of ceremony. Back then, it was taken very seriously, so seriously that unmarried mothers would not be allowed to participate, to go to church. So they would, that would be a blemish on their reputation, and that would mark their life and the life of the baby forever. And in fact, it was still the case between the two world wars in Slovakia that single mothers would not go to church to receive the ceremony, but it would be done in their homes. Today, this is no longer practiced. Moving on to, so let's assume everything is fine. The baby is doing well, the mother doing well. We now are, both the baby and the mother are back in normal day-to-day life. To protect the baby, the mother carried the baby with her everywhere. So she would carry the baby at home, it would be tied to her body. The baby would be taken out to the fields where this impromptu cradles would be made for them. And that was all done so that the mother would never leave the baby out of her sight. And that way, the baby would be under the protection of the mother at all times, 24/7. Again, this goes back to the belief, or not the belief, back to the fact that still at the beginning of 20th century, at the end of 19th, 20th century, a woman would give birth to, on average, 10 to 14 children, but only half of them would make it to adulthood. So families, the community, the women would do whatever was in their powers to protect the baby. And with little kind of economic power at their hands, they would resort to these practices and rituals and kind of ritual oversight over the baby. The baby was happy and it was growing up. Soon it would receive his or her first clothes. Now this wouldn't be the cute baby clothes we know today. It wouldn't even be miniature versions of the kroy, the traditional folk wear. Both little girls and little boys, as soon as they could walk, they would receive a simple linen shirt, and that would be their attire for a few years. At the age of 3, the boys would be given their first trousers, and the girls first parts of the folk attire of kroy. But this was only towards the end of the 19th century. Childhood in rural Slovakia up until the First and the Second, and then later Second World War, was indeed time to play, to explore, to have fun. But as soon as children grew up and were large enough and responsible enough, they would take care of their younger siblings. They would help around the house. They would help taking care of the elderly. They would be responsible for taking goats or animals out to pasture Boys would be helping the father, girls would be helping the mother. So their kind of carefree time really was limited because every hand was needed in those families at the time. Nevertheless, children are children, so they would always find an opportunity to play, whether that was when they were outside with the goats or with the cows, and they would dance and sing or play hide and seek, whether that was singing together as they were together with their siblings. There indeed were those cheerful and beautiful moments in one's childhood. Children would also have toys. This would be handmade, simple toys, such as little wooden dolls or mini equipment that was given to boys and girls so that they could practice the work that would be expected of them when they grow up. Little wooden marbles or balls, these kind of things. So very, very, very simple toys that were nevertheless cherished and that were precious. The point I already hinted at that of these toys was not just to entertain the children, but also to prepare them for their future roles as women and mothers and as fathers of the families. And a mother would take care of preparing the girls, while the father would make sure that the boys were ready to become a head of the family and to be able to take care of their families when time comes. So girls would learn to make clothes, to cook, they would learn about herbs and various healing methods, because they would perform as healers for the family. They would take care of the elderly and of their siblings to be prepared to look after their parents when they get older and after their children when they have them. Boys were expected to master a craft or learn how to build things, how to build a house, how to mend tools, how to work in the fields. And all of that was integral to the consequent phases in their life. And as they grew up, let me move this, and reach adulthood or teenagehood, it was time to start thinking about marriage. For girls, marriageable age was 16. And they did not have that much time to find a husband, because if they were still unmarried by the age of 20, they would be considered spinsters. For boys, the marriageable age was 24, and a boy was considered ready when he could take care of the family and provide for the family. Young people were encouraged to mingle and get to know each other with the purpose of getting together and getting married after the harvest was in. So when autumn came and there was a lot less work around the house, there was no work in the field, this was the opportunity for young people to come together, to have parties, to get to know one another, to play games. There would also be further parties and merriment during the Fashiangi, the carnival season after Christmas. So this was all fun and it was great, but dating and marriage indeed had to conform to certain rules and norms. So young people were not entirely free to choose whoever they wanted. There are many things to take into consideration. And there were people in the family and in the community to do that. So when the time came for young men to get married, it would be usually his mother or other trusted woman from the family who would begin the process. In other instances, the family would use the services of a matchmaker. So you wanted a woman who knew all all the girls in the community, a woman that knew their families, and was familiar with not just kind of social ranking of those families, of their financial affairs, but also of the nature and the character of the girls. So she would be in the position to advise which girl is the best for the boy, for the son. What was very important at this stage was that the groom and the bride came from households that were of similar social standing in the society. Too much of a difference either way was not welcome. Practical matters such as family properties, fields, if a family owned one, were an important element in deciding who would be the best to marry, because people were often preferred to merge the fields, to merge the land. So they would look for families that would be able to facilitate that. But the girl herself was very important. It was not so much about her beauty or charms, but about her ability to bear children. So the health of the girl would be closely examined, as well as her ability to work hard. Because once this young woman joined the family of the groom, she was not just wife of the son. This was another pair of hands in the family that were much needed. So girls who had a reputation for being lazy or not being skilled at household work, those girls would not be in the first pick of prospective brides. Once a suitable girl was identified, first the mother of the boy, of the groom, or a matchmaker would visit the girl's family to do a preliminary check whether the family was interested in such a match. If that was a yes, this would be followed by a more serious visit of the groom with his mother. At this stage, things were getting more serious and it was more binding. And this is where the families actually got together and discussed more of the details of the marriage, of the dowry. And the final step in this dating process was the groom visiting with a man from the family. This is when the girl would be invited to join the talks and to express her agreement or not with the planned marriage. This is when the last details, the legal details of the union would be made. And either on the same occasion or immediately after that, there would be an engagement. And once couple was engaged, that was binding and serious, and any withdrawal from that would come with certain consequences. So what happened on the engagement was that the families got together, the young couple got together to exchange gifts. She would give him a couple of embroidered shirts that she embroidered herself. He would give her perhaps a simple ring or a piece of clothing. The bride-to-be would receive a little money or fabrics from her mother-in-law to be. And this was basically signing a contract. So from now on, there was no going back, only forward. And if a couple or if someone, one of them wanted to break the agreement, this would reflect poorly on the families, and it was also damage the standing of the families in the society and the future marriage prospects of the young man and of the young woman. So this was a big no-no. It did not happen much for those reasons. When the engagement was in, the banns reading the process would continue with the reading of the banns in the church for the duration of 3 Sundays to announce the impeding wedding and to check on any obstacles or disagreements with the marriage. And if that went smoothly, then the wedding day would come. And in the past, wedding looked a lot different from what we are used to experiencing now. So indeed, for those period of 3 weeks, the wedding would be prepared. The community would chip in with food and whatever help they could provide to the families preparing the wedding, because the wedding was not just a family affair, it was very much a community gathering that everybody took part in and that everybody looked forward to. This was an opportunity to forget one's worries and to just have fun and enjoy life. So hence everybody was involved and they had those 3 weeks to prepare for it. Weddings would normally take place after Christmas and before the Great Lent period. So this is the time of Fashiangi or the Carnival season. When this was, again, for practical reasons, it was still winter, not much could be done in the fields. And so people had time to prepare a wedding and to celebrate. A wedding would last for 6 days. Then later on in the 20th century, it was shortened to 3 days. So this was not possible to do in spring or in summer or during the harvest season when the family was busy doing other things. So February, second half of January and February, and maybe the beginning of March were the wedding season across the country. And by the time wedding arrived and everything had to be ready, the bride's dowry had to be prepared. The dowry would not be prepared in those 3 weeks. Any good mother who had daughters would make sure that this was her duty to prepare the dowry for her daughters, and this would be done. Well, the process of preparing the dowry would start when the girls were still little babies. So, but at the end of it, before the wedding, this was an opportunity to just tie up any loose knots and make sure everything is ready. And when the day came, the guests of the groom would gather at the groom's house or the groom's parents' house, and the guests of the bride would come to the house of her parents. Simultaneously, the bride and the groom would thank their parents for looking after them, for teaching them, for helping them to grow into a young man or a young woman. And this was, as you can imagine, a very emotional moment, especially for the bride's family, because the bride, the girl, as soon as she married, she would leave the family, she would leave the house, and she would move in with her husband and join his family. So with this being done, the groom, either alone or with his close friends, or sometimes with the entire band of his wedding guests, would go to the house of the bride, fetch the bride, and together they would go to church. This is where in church was actually when the wedding guests from both sides would first gather. And there would be a beautiful long procession with music, and I know everybody cheering, everybody being very much part of the occasion, leading the young couple to the church where the ceremony would be performed. When that was done, or perhaps just did a side note on the attire of the bride and the groom, it was not the white wedding dress up until really the Second World War in the rural countryside of Slovakia. The couple would wear traditional folk attire. This would be special. This would be the most ornamental version of the kroj, and it was prepared specially for this occasion, especially for the wedding, and especially the bride's dress was spectacular and special, and a lot of effort went into preparing it. The girl would embroider, would sew her own wedding kroj during the long winter and autumn evenings as she prepared to get married, because getting married for girls, really getting married and having a family, being mothers, that was the point of their existence. Girls very much looked forward to being married. There were little options available to them outside of marriage, and on the one hand, they were excited about it, they looked forward to it. On the other hand, there was also a certain anxiety about like not finding that suitable partner and not being able to perform those duties. And in order to make sure that that wouldn't happen, girls would engage in various practices at certain times of year. So there would be fortune telling at Christmas, when girls would try to guess who their husband would be. There were also some folk practices at Easter, at Christmas, that were to attract that man into their life. This differed across the regions, but one example of that would be a girl putting male trousers under her pillow and sleep on it during Christmas to kind of speed up the process, to make sure that a suitable suitor would appear in her life soon, because after Christmas comes that wedding season. So that's the precious window of opportunity to get married. But once so it's successful and they're already in a church, the ceremony is performed, then the couple separates again. She goes to the house of her parents, he goes to the house of his parents, and the wedding guests split too, and the couple and the family celebrate separately. In the evening, the groom goes to fetch his bride to bring her home as his wife and to introduce her to her new home and her new family. This was another emotional moment of the day, because together with the girl leaving, her dowry would be leaving, and the most important part of the dowry were the quilts, the perini. No respectable girl could get married without having at least one. And perhaps you know, these were made from goose feathers. They were very heavy, they were big, because they were to take in not just the couple, but also children as they were born. It took a long time to prepare the goose feathers to stuff the quilt. So it was one of the most precious possessions of the bride. So all of that would be loaded onto a carriage, the quilt, the fabrics, any pieces of furniture, kitchen equipment, clothes that she had, and in a procession, amid singing and tears and crying and hugs, she would leave her home, her old home, and the family that she was born into, and she would join the family and the house of her husband to start a new life. And that really was the beginning of a whole new process. Again, babies would be born probably not long after the wedding, and the circle of life would continue turning. And here we come to the end of the cycle of life, death and funeral, which is not often talked about, not nearly as often as weddings are, but nevertheless, this was an important part of the family and of the community life. One thing to realize here is that people were born and died at home, not in hospitals as it is now, not in establishments kind of for the elderly. So the connection with death was much closer. A person dying, that would affect in the very immediate terms the entire family. It's not something that happened far away, and so it looked very different. And again, the entire family would be engaged and would be a part of it. people would watch out for certain signs, such as appearance of certain birds, animals, to predict death coming into the family. They would also try to guess like, who would be the first to die during holidays and during Christmas, when we do see these fortune telling practices as part of Christmas festivities, simply to prepare the family. Death was a part of life. It was a very daily part of life. People did not live as long as they do today. Again, we are talking about the time of illnesses and pandemics and poor medical care. Very few people could afford to see a doctor. So whatever happened really happened in the family and affected everyone. The hope and the dream of everyone was to die peacefully and gracefully, and the entire family was to assist with that. But before it even came to that, people would prepare for the final day. Women would prepare the clothes that they would wear in the coffin at a relatively young age, at around 40. They would make sure that they had a black skirt, a black bodice, ready, fresh underwear. And indeed, there would have to be a Bible and a rosary present. Black was the mourning color at the end of the 19th and in the 20th century as it is now, but before mourning color was actually white. For men, they would prepare their kroj, their folk attire. Later on, this would be replaced by a suit. They would make sure that their coffin was ready, so as to have peace of mind, so they could depart with everything that they needed to be done, and so as not to burden the family in those difficult days. So when the time came for a person to die, and it was again, the whole family would be part of it, and the whole family would observe what was happening. If the dying was difficult, it was presumed that the soul of the person cannot leave, either because the person has an unresolved disagreement with someone, is in debt, is angry with someone, or it's something internal to them. So if that was the case, priest would be called in to have to give the person an opportunity to confess and to prepare their soul to depart. If that was something external, such as disagreement, the family would do their best to make sure that it was settled so that person can die in peace. And when the person did, their eyes would be closed. 2 coins would be placed on the eyes, 1 on each eye, because it was said that a dead person could, even after death, could still look for someone in the family to take with them to the other side. So placing the coins on their eyes would prevent that. Mirror would be covered. If there was a mirror in the room, would be covered with something, because it was believed that when death visits and she sees herself in the mirror, she would be tempted to come back for more family members to take away. Windows were open to allow the soul to fly to heaven rather than to linger around, and the body would be prepared for funeral as soon as possible. So it would be washed, it would be smudged with herbs and sprinkled with holy water in those special funerary clothes and displayed in the house, in one room in the house. A candle would be lit there as a symbol of eternal life and as a source of light to guide the source to the other side. And in some regions, someone would always remain with the deceased in that room for the duration of that one night. As soon as a person died, someone in the family would be tasked with the duty of visiting everyone in the community to let them know of the sad news. And once the news spread, people would start trickling into the house to pay respects, but also to learn about the time of the funeral and to support the mourning family. So the body would be displayed in the house during the night. And this was still practiced in Slovak villages when I was a child. So that's not that long ago. After that, the fashion of mourning houses, that's how they're called in Slovakia, mourning houses are usually located at cemeteries. Those started to appear on the scene, so the body would be taken there and it would not remain at home anymore. And this is the case in towns, in cities, and in the larger villages that have such a facility available to them. One important thing about laying the body, it was important that the body was facing the entrance, the door, with their feet, because that was said it would ease the departure. If the body was oriented in any other way, it was said that the soul could get confused and could get stuck in the world of the living, possibly causing havoc to the living family, and if not, being restless in any case, and that would not be a good thing. The day after, in the morning, coffin would arrive. A special cloth would be placed inside it, along with the Bible and the rosary and small items of everyday use of the deceased. Then the deceased would go in, and this coffin would then be taken out of the house, legs first, and knocking on each door frame 3 times as a sign of final departure. Before the mourning houses, the funerary ceremony performed by a priest would be done in the yard. So there would be a special table laid out, covered with white cloth, and with a cross. And this is where the coffin would be laid for the priest to perform the ritual. And then the deceased, the body, the coffin, would be taken to the cemetery to be buried amid the ringing of bells. When somebody died in the community, this was also announced fairly immediately with special ringing of the bells. So there was a special tune that was rung that let everybody know that somebody in the community died, and that's how people were notified before they received that visitor who came in with the details. After the funeral, there was a wake when the closest family would be invited to feast in honor of the deceased, but it was also a means to gather as a family and as a community and to give support to one another. During those first days, sometimes even weeks after death, the community again would come in to help, bringing food, offering help to help the family cross and bridge that difficult time in their family existence. It's important to say that back in the day, because everything was, death was much closer to everyone, and so was birth. Dying was considered as natural, normal part of life that was to be not feared, but rather to kind of eased and allowed to happen, so that departure can be easy, and so that a person would not struggle, because with them the entire family would struggle. And in this way, many people died, were born, and then died in the same house. That's how compact life was, and that's how immediate it was. all these ceremonies and rituals and traditions that we mentioned today, they were partly informed by Christianity, because Slovakia was and still is Christian culture, and majority of Slovaks are Catholics. So indeed, the faith influenced all these rites of passage and all these ceremonies and rituals, but much of it also stems from a close relationship with nature. Like, say, at the end, when people were watching out for birds or animals to appear, to arrive, to announce the arrival of death. Many of them were steeped in pre-Christian traditions, such as, for instance, Vatska, so the ritual of purification of a woman after birth. And together they formed this fascinating mosaic that really governed everybody's life not so long ago. These rites of passage were something that everybody went through. It did not just have a social meaning, there was cultural, spiritual significance to everything that was happening to a person from the point they were born to the point that they died. And all these customs and rituals really beautifully encompass the down-to-earth nature of Slovak people, the humility and the humbleness, but also the ability to celebrate those special moments in life. And it really is those rites of passage that we say, so there's birth, there's christening, and there's kind of the introduction to adulthood, this wedding, engagement. Becoming a mother was a big change in one's life, so that had all sorts of practices around it during pregnancy and immediately after childbirth. These are all kind of practices that we are returning to now, that we're realizing how important they are, because they don't only facilitate the flow of life and the transition from one stage of life to another, but really brings the family and the community together, which was also the purpose, because the survival of the community was dependent on their ability to work together, on how close-knit the community and the family was. So at this point, I would like to invite any questions.
We have time for about 3 questions, so please do not be shy and just ask your question on camera.
Or in the chat.
Yeah, preferably on camera, because we would love to see your face.
Yes, Savi. Oh, one sort of cute thing I forgot to mention. Now I'm looking at the children. Going to school, the mandatory education was introduced only towards the 19th century, really, in the Kingdom of Hungary, where Slovakia belonged. And it was so boys and girls alike between the ages of 6 and 12 had to attend school once the law was passed, but in practice it looked a bit different. Schools were not everywhere. Not everybody found themselves in proximity to one. That was one reason why not all children went to a school. The other one was that simply the kids were needed at home, and the family could not afford for them to regularly attend classes. But there were also other reasons, such as not having enough pairs of shoes for all the children in the family. So there are numerous cases when the kids would have one pair of shoes, and these shoes would be shared by everyone, and they would rotate among the siblings, and the one that had the shoes on the day would go to school, taking the knowledge and the information to then share it with the siblings.
And just so you guys know that this isn't a practice that ended sometime in the 1800s. It actually was something that was quite prevalent in the rural parts of Slovakia up until the introduction of communism. People didn't have shoes and would share shoes across the family, which actually beautifully leads into the question we have here by Barb. How did they do multiple marriages on the same day? I assume in the same venue. Gabriela, would you like to respond?
That was rather unlikely. There would be rare instances of that happening, but those communities were small. In cities and towns that was different, but in a countryside, the villages were small, and the period of Fashiangi, so carnival season, would be long enough to give opportunity for everyone who wanted to get married to get married. That's not to say that weddings did not take place outside of the season. In rare instances, they did. Say there was a baby on the way or something like that, marriage would be and the wedding would be hastened, but it was not a common practice because there was, as I said, there was no time for that. But no, there were no joint weddings, because even though people lived simple lives, it was a matter of honor to put on a wedding and to put on a good wedding. So you wanted to put your best foot forward and to really, for the wedding to be representative of your family and your achievements.
Just to jump in there, so Barb, you mentioned that in 1894 in the small village of your ancestors, there were 3 marriages in your family on the same day. So that could have just been also a convenience and cost-saving maneuver. Maybe they didn't have the money to, afford 3 separate flashy celebratory weddings. So they decided to economize and just do 3 in 1. But I don't think that was a common practice. That is what Gabriela is referring to. And there's another question here by Michael. Can you recommend sources? If is this Professor Kopanek?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I think, well, Gabriela studied culture and folk culture at the University of Nitra. She has a master's in it, but I think Gabriela could perhaps send you an email to recommend some books. There's a bit of a revival in Slovakia regarding in the Slovak language, documenting these customs. People are gifting these books to each other at Christmas, urban people, Christmas and birthdays. So they really are bestsellers. So I think it's best to communicate that via email. I see we have one more.
Also, I have another question. There was a funeral mass, wasn't there? Because you talked about meeting outside before the body was taken to the cemetery, but there was a mass, wasn't there? And was the coffin taken into the church?
Wasn't there? Sorry, I didn't hear the end of it.
Was the coffin taken
Was the coffin taken into the church or not?
Normally, no. It would be taken straight to the cemetery.
So was there a mass?
Yes, but well, depends. Sometimes, the ceremony, sort of in the older times, so the 18th, beginning of 19th century, that really would take place just in the yard. That would be it.
There would be a mass in the yard? Is that what you're, outdoor mass? An outdoor mass in the,
as in a priest?
Yeah, so it was like basically what
even
would
in the
happen
winter
in
time?
church, but it was
Even in the
rolled
winter
into
time?
one.
Even in the winter
And
time?
then there would be the, the actual burying ceremony at the cemetery.
Yeah, the burying up ceremony is not the same as a mass.
No.
And another question I have is about the mixing of Protestants and Catholics and Jews. Did they attend these ceremonies? And I mean, because even when I was a child, we were forbidden to go into Protestant churches.
I assume there was not that much intermixing. People were just segregated within their communities, whether they were Catholics or Protestants, and of course Jews were more removed.
Well, even here in America, like for instance, in Central City, Pennsylvania, there's a separate section of the cemetery for Catholic burials, Protestant burials, and Greek Catholic burials and Jewish burials. So they were all
Well, the Jews, they had
buried in
their
different
own,
sections of the cemetery.
well, the Jews had their own cemeteries altogether.
Yeah.
Up and, you know, and you can see that in Slovakia, actually, they're usually on the outskirts.
But a lot of the
Of,
villages
towns and
only had
cities.
about one or two families of Jews, some of the villages. And they
They would
oftentimes
still
ran
be-
the local inn.
They would still be outside. There is, from what I've seen, they're always outside. You get these tiny, forgotten, many by now gone, little cemeteries with just few Jewish graves there. So they would not mix with the Christian population at all.
Okay, moving on. So we have another question here. It says, were arranged marriages at birth a typical thing? I assume, again, this is probably quite rare. Arranged marriages would be arranged more strategically closer to the marrying age.
Yeah.
How long?
In the
Go ahead.
folk population, you know, like this is what covered today. There was the Slovak folk culture. It would be a bit different for obviously the aristocracy or the nobility in towns and cities, but for the majority of folk, when the time came, they would look for a suitable bride, the one that was of the right religion, the right age, from the right kind of class. So yeah, there wouldn't be such a long strategic planning that would take place already at birth. There was really no reason for that, as families responded to the needs that they had in the moment, not 15 years before. Sabine?
I just wanted to also comment on the death rates. It's quite interesting, Gabby. Gabby, you noted as well that you remember the bodies being shown at the home. So I still remember that as well. But it is interesting in the village in Eastern Slovakia where I'm from, they don't have mass as it is here, where you bring the coffin into the church. That's not practiced. You really have to convince a priest to do that. It's only for bishops or a clergy that are high rank in the church. And the priest, what he still does is now they go to these homes, but you have a blessing and you do the farewell and there's prayers and singing, and then as a procession they move from the Dom Smutku to the burial place, and the mass might happen that day or another day, but there isn't a mass. And that's, I think, quite interesting, because here in the US there is always a burial mass. So something that's still practiced in Slovakia, I think, at least in Eastern Slovakia, that they don't have a burial mass the same exact day, perhaps.
So it differs between regions, but also case to case. Also between what the family could afford, because they always offer something to the priest and to the church for carrying it out. So depending on how much time they had, because today, it's one thing to remember, we have all these technologies and the body can be stored for a few days, but back then it had to happen kind of, person died and the next day they were buried. So that's why also the rituals and customs were kept so simple. And they got more elaborate with the time. And of course, they were much more elaborate for the more you could afford as a family. So, yeah.
Okay, so the last question we have here is in the chat, and it mentioned, how long were the engagements? Again, I assume they were quite short once a decision was made. Also, the youngsters were anxious to
get on with it.
As were the families, to have the next generation born, the next young male, the heir to the estates or the little plots of land. So Gabby, what would you say? A few months max?
Oh, no, that wouldn't usually be a few months. From the point when the agreement was struck and the engagement was official, they could get married as quickly as in 3 weeks, because 3 weeks was the minimal period of reading out the banns in church. And you know, they wouldn't plan a wedding for a year if they had other things to worry about. So I know when all this was decided that things would move pretty fast.
Mhm. Pragmatic, salt of the earth people that, yeah, acted in the now, acted in the present, as you said, according to present needs. Sabina, you mentioned here beautiful photos. Yes, Gabriella, wonderful presentation.
Yes.
Very, very rich in information and knowledge. Thank you so much. I think people will even enjoy listening to it on repeat because there's just so much information in there. And absolutely incredible visual representation of those rights in these very powerful photos that you selected. So thank you so much also for the visual journey and bringing that knowledge and wisdom to life. Lastly, thank you to Jednota and of course Sabina for facilitating this webinar series also. We're very grateful to work with Jednota and to expand our reach to a new community, and to also have their patronage in support of Global Slovakia. So thank you so much, Jednota, as well.
Yes, thank you so much. And just to throw it out there, it's late where we are, so if we're a little bit slower, that is why. But it's always an absolute honor and pleasure to connect with you, and we love doing those webinars for you.
So thank you so much, and have a wonderful evening ahead of you. We're gonna head off to bed and see you next time.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Do widzenia.
Bye.
Dobrou noc.
Dobrou noc.